Hi everyone, welcome to this. This is the very last recorded lecture you'll have to listen to on this module, hopefully, unless things go pear-shaped in the next few weeks. But this is also the last lecture with new content in it. So from this point on, anything else we'll do in the last 2 weeks of the module is just revision. It's getting you ready for the exam. So this is the lecture that would normally take place in class on the 3rd of December. And as we know, the 3rd of December is D-Day for the written assignment. So if you're listening to this lecture before the 3rd of December, don't forget. Okay, I think I've over-labored that point. Now, a reading list for this particular topic, I haven't a specific reading list. But if you look at the Moodle page, there's a wide range of different resources made available in the Moodle page. The same applies to the first part of this lecture, where I looked at the history of human geography in Ireland up to the 1970s. So there's a number of journal articles you can dip into. As well as that, what we're talking about in Ireland, you can also think about what's happening in the world at large in terms of geography. So when I'm talking when I'm talking about trends in geography in, say, the 2000s, this links into what we've covered in the last 5 lectures or so in the module, the geographies of postmodernity, or rather the geographies of the 21st century, if you want to put it that way, modern contemporary geographies. So there are resources there. You can use the online resources. You can also, if we're talking about, say, critical geographies in Ireland, you can link back with the suggested readings for critical geographies in general, as outlined in the previous recorded lectures. So anyway, we move on. Now, guys, if you have taken the time to listen to this lecture, if you care about the history of academic geography in Ireland, I'm going to give you an Easter egg here, not for a short assignment this time, an Easter egg for the exam. What I want you to think about, not just in relation to this lecture, but in relation to the lecture I did way back at the end of October. Well, actually I did it, well, it was way back at the end of October. It would have been in class. It was the week after I broke my arm. So almost the first or the second of the recorded lectures. The recorded lecture I did on the history of academic geography in Ireland up to the 1970s. So if you join this lecture together with that lecture, what I want you to think about is the different ways you can try to understand the history of Irish geography. Now, way back at the end of September, start of October, I talked about different histories of geography. I suggested there's 2 different ways you can think about the history of geography. The first of these is an internalist perspective. In this case, you try to understand the history of geography from the point of view of what's happening in geography itself, what's happening in terms of geography departments, what's happening in terms of individual geographers, what's happening in terms of universities, how universities operate. So looking at the history of geography from an internalist perspective, solely focusing on what's happening within geography departments or within universities. So as it says, the classic book for looking at an internalist perspective generally is viewed as being Geography and Geographers, and it suggests this basically allows you to think about what's the prevailing occupational structure in universities, what's the organizational framework that guides research. So basically this way of thinking about the history of geography and the history of geography in Ireland, you're putting the focus on what's happening within geography itself, what's happening within geography departments, also what's happening within universities as well. So in that case, you're trying to think about, okay, the pioneers, the focus in terms of this way of understanding the history, you're thinking of the pioneers of Irish geography. You're thinking about where Irish geography came from, the links between French regional geography and the University of Aberystwyth, the links between the University of Aberystwyth and the emergence of Irish geography, or more specifically Irish regional geography, and you're looking at what was happening within Irish geography at the point in time. The fact that there was very few full-time geography lecturers and even fewer full-time human geography lecturers. The importance of the Geographical Society of Ireland as an alternate means of encouraging geographical research and geographical work to be done. You can also think about the makeup of different departments, the fact that generally, probably up to the 1990s, geography departments were very much male-dominated spaces, up to the 1990s, maybe even the 2000s even. But also the counterexample we mentioned, the fact that it wasn't the case that women weren't interested in doing geography. When you looked at what women were doing on a voluntary basis, what was being done on a voluntary basis, say, for the Geographical Society of Ireland, you were seeing the work of women, significant work being done by women geographers on a voluntary basis. So first articles in the Irish Geography Journal, quite a number of those were written by female geographers. So the internalist perspective, trying to understand the history of geography, the history of the different approaches in human geography, in our case, the history of human geography in Ireland, in terms of what's happening internally in universities, in geography departments. The alternative way to understand the history of geography is to think about what's happening on the outside. What's the social, political, and cultural and economic context that shapes human geography at different points in time? So Johnson Sidaway says, some geographers have argued the major influence on their discipline's content and approaches comes from a combination of its wider environment, particularly its economic, social, and political milieu, basically economic, social, and political context, as well as changes in other subjects. And later on, you might remember we said this on the module way back in September, all ideas come from somewhere. Thinking about where ideas come from help us to understand how they are shaped by their historical and geographical context, how they have changed over time, and how they relate to each other. Sorry, I've cut out that last word there. It's each other. So the social political context, this allows this, if you're using a contextual approach, we're basically trying to understand the development of academic geography in terms of how it was shaped by social, political, and cultural factors at different points in time. Trying to understand the different periods in which different approaches to human geography or different trends in Irish geography emerged. So the idea that society changes, politics changes, economics, economies change, and whatever the cultural and political and social economic background is at one point in time, we'll say the 1930s, things changed. 30 years later, things have changed socially, politically, culturally, and economically. And this change, this changing economic, political, social, cultural climate will in turn have an impact on universities and will in turn have an impact on academic geography and will in turn have an impact on academic human geography. So the idea of this close link between geography as well and at times and the social, cultural, political elites, the idea that in past times, particularly in the lead up to, say, the period up to the 1970s, there was this sense that geography had to be useful. It should be serving the needs of the political and cultural elites at specific points in time. Geography should be of use to the state. Geography should be of use to politicians and decision makers. Now, one of the last points we finished on in relation to the lecture looking at the history of academic geography in the 1970s, we made the point that up to the late 1960s, there wasn't that much really happening in terms of academic geography in the Republic of Ireland. Geography departments were small. There were very few full-time lecturers in some geography departments, but and the number of lecturers in geography departments in the Republic of Ireland was notably smaller than the number in Northern Ireland, which was then and is still part of the United Kingdom. There was, however, significant work being done by Irish geographers. One Irish geographer in particular, around this period, the 1960s, 1970s, was making a name for herself on a global level, and that was Anne Buttermore, who emerges as one of the world's leading, if not the leading, geographers to be associated with the humanistic geography approach, so the approach of humanistic geography. Again, I'll actually make this point at this point in time. A few of you do this at times. Don't get confused between humanistic geography, which is one of many approaches to human geography that we've looked at on this module so far, and human geography. Human geography covers everything, all the approaches. So humanistic geography is just one approach. So when you're writing about humanistic geography, it's not all of human geography. You're writing to this one specific approach. An approach of which Anne Buttermore was very much one of the leading lights. So now Anne Buttermore is interesting in that at this point in time in her career, she was an Irish geographer. She was obviously trained in Ireland, but at this point of her career, she was outside of Ireland. So most of her career, up to her probably the last decade or so, most of her career was outside of Ireland. She did, at the end of her career, move to UCD and finish her career as the head of the department in the Department of Geography in UCD. But probably as a geographer, had more impact globally than she had in Ireland, especially in the latter part of the 1900s. She was a very significant person in terms of humanistic geography, the humanistic geography approach. She was also a very significant person in terms of the global geographical community. She never became the president of the Geographical Society of Ireland. Now, she was a member, but she wasn't really an active member of the Geographical Society of Ireland. She was more involved with the global Geographical Society, the International Geographical Union, and she was president of the International Geographical Union, which is basically like the president of the world when it comes to, if you're looking at the world of geographers. So an interesting person, very much one of the most significant geographers to have emerged in the last 100 years, and she's Irish, one of the leading people, if not the leading people, in the humanistic geography approach. Now, what was happening in Ireland? You might remember we talked about what happened between the 1960s and 1970s. Things started to change in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, in the late 60s and early 1970s. Number one, the economic conditions started to improve under the Taoiseach of the time, Sean Lemass, a member of Fianna Fáil. So economically, Ireland had been, let's be honest, economically, the Republic of Ireland, from the point in time when it became an independent state up until the late 1950s, early 1960s, it was probably by and large an economic basket case. In terms of economic well-being, living standards fell well below those across most, if not all, of Western Europe. Ireland was not doing well economically in this period up to at least the early 1960s. Sean Lemass's economic policies did promote a bit of a mini economic boom in the Republic of Ireland, however, in the 1960s. And for the first time ever in the history of the state up to that point in time, you actually had more people moving back to the state in the late 60s and 1970s than you had people moving out of the state. Prior, up to the late 1960s, the general trend in Ireland was one of almost constant out-migration. There were certain peaks in time where you had a big upsurge in out-migration levels. The 1950s was one period. But the 1960s, things looked rosier economically. And it obviously meant the government now, because the economy is doing well, the government had now more money to spend. And one of the things that the government spent money on was education. So two things happened. The first thing probably fed into the second thing. In the late 1960s, 1968 I think it was, the Minister for Education, Donogh O'Malley, who died literally a year after he brought this in, decided he would bring in free secondary education for the first point in time. Up to that point in time, it cost money to go into secondary education. And it meant that most people, most of the children going into secondary education, very few lasted all the way through secondary education. There was very few students lasted long enough to do their Leaving Cert up until the late 60s. And if you look at, say, the educational profiles of people who were born, say, before 1950 and after 1950, you'll notice there's a much higher percentage of people who didn't finish their education with a Leaving Cert in that cohort that were born before 1950. Donogh O'Malley's decision to bring in free secondary education changed all that. The knock-on effect of this was more and more students would be staying in school until the Leaving Cert. More and more would be going to secondary school, would be completing their secondary school education. The knock-on effect of that was you're now going to need more geography teachers, and to have more geography teachers, you now needed more geography lecturers to train these geography teachers. So the knock-on effects of the boom and the introduction of free secondary education, you can think of these as very positive contextual effects, was that suddenly in the 1970s, for the first time really in the history of the state, the Irish government was willing to provide universities with enough funding to appoint a large number of lecturers, including a large number of geography lecturers. And the number of geography lecturers literally mushroomed in the space of a few years in the early 1970s. The easiest example to think about this is to look at Maynooth. Maynooth had no geography department. 1972, Maynooth appointed its first geography lecturer, Paddy Duffy. A few years later, late 1970s, there were 6 full-time geography lecturers in Maynooth. What was then called St. Patrick's College, Maynooth. Now, I'll say about what happens after the late 1970s a few slides on. Who were these new lecturers? As I explained in the previous lecture on Irish Human Geography, what's interesting about these lecturers was a large number of these new lecturers were themselves Irish geographers. They were Irish people. Remember, the pioneer geography lecturers were both British. Well, if you look at all 3 of them, Freeman as well, the very first full-time geography lecturers in Ireland, they were all British. They were all trained in Britain. Now, the new geography lecturers who were appointed in the 1970s, they were nearly all Irish-born. What was different about them was they were Irish-born geography students who had to go abroad to do for postgraduate studies, because Irish geography departments were so small back in those days that there was no master's programs possible, and there was definitely no PhD program. So if you wanted to do a master's in geography or a PhD in those days, you had to go overseas to do it. So many Irish geographers went to countries like Canada. Was very popular. Canada was a popular destination, or the United States of America, or the United Kingdom, or even Europe. Now, when they went to these countries, they were exposed to the newest geographical ideas. So some geographers like Prunchie Spratnock, he was referred to as Fran Walsh in his earlier career. Prunchie Spratnock, one of the first lecturers in Maynooth, Prunchie Spratnock was exposed to the ideas of Marxist geography and brought those ideas back when he was appointed as a geography lecturer in Maynooth in the 1970s. Paddy Duffy was exposed to the ideas of humanistic geography, and he brought those ideas back with him when he was appointed as a lecturer in Maynooth geography. Dennis Pringle was exposed to the ideas of Marxist geography, but also spatial science, so he brought those ideas back with him when he was appointed as a geography lecturer. I'm trying to remember now, I'm obviously forgetting someone here. So Prunchie's, Seamus Smith, actually is interesting enough. He was the first full-time, long-time head of the department He was head of the department more or less from the 1970s up until, oh God, probably the mid-1990s. He was very much a historical geographer. So as such, wasn't too far out of kilter with the old traditional regional geography approach in terms of the way he thought about geography. So that was the big story in the 1970s. Big investment in university education, a knock-on effect of the mini economic boom, a knock-on effect of the opening up of secondary school education. Who were the geographers who were appointed? They were generally all Irish-born geographers, but they were all Irish-born geographers who were trained overseas and were exposed to the new approaches at that time: spatial science, humanistic geography, Marxist geography, and so on. Now, what happens in the 1980s? As I said, there was this big upsurge in employment levels in Irish universities, probably from 1970 up until maybe 1976, 1977. And then things went pear-shaped economically in the Republic of Ireland. So the beginnings of the problems dates back to 1974, the global oil crisis, which more or less led to a major economic recession across the Western world. A lot of Western countries managed to get out of that recession maybe 5-10 years later. The Republic of Ireland took roughly 20 years to get out of that recession, and things got bad, and very bad, very quickly. And things probably got hit rock bottom in the 1980s. So the government now no longer had all the extra taxes it had to spend with the economic boom. Governments were trying to make cutbacks. They were definitely not going to be investing any more in education. They were trying to cut things back more than add things. So what did this mean for geography departments? What it meant was that more or less, wherever geography departments stood in the mid-1970s, that's more or less where they stayed for the next 15 years or so. So in Maynooth, we had 6 geography lecturers, 5 human geographers, a physical geographer, John Sweeney, in the mid, roughly, they were all appointed by roughly 1977. There was no new full-time geographer appointed in Maynooth for the next 15 years until Paul Gibson, another physical geographer, was appointed in 1992. So there was effectively a break put on any new hires into geography departments. So there was a period of stagnation. So on the one hand, there was no new people entering geography departments. On the other hand, more and more students were going to university. There were grants available for students like myself who came from rural backgrounds or working class backgrounds to be able to go to university. So the government was making it a little bit easier for students to go to university, but they weren't allowing for any new lecturers to be appointed. So lecturers were having to deal with more and more students, and a lot of their time was more or less taken up with, obviously, doing lectures. You do the same number of lectures, probably no matter what the number, but lecturers would ultimately now find, instead of having to grade work for maybe 90 students, they were now grading work for maybe, in some cases, 250 students. So lecturers' workloads just upsurged in the 1980s. So there wasn't really, research was still being done, but there wasn't really much time to engage with new ideas. There wasn't much time available to go to overseas conferences. There wasn't the money or resources to go to overseas conferences. Now, that was the story in terms of the Irish university sector and indeed Irish human geography, more or less up until the early 1990s. From the early 1990s onwards, things started to change in a more positive direction very quickly, especially with the emergence of the Celtic Tiger. So with the emergence of the Celtic Tiger in the mid-1990s, you start to see once again another period of more and more investment in education. The first Minister for Education appointed after the 1997 general election was our current Taoiseach, Micheál Martin. And Micheál Martin was very proactive as a Minister for Education when he took up the role roughly between 1997 and the early 2000s. So Micheál Martin was very proactive in terms of promoting investment in universities, promoting investment in university departments, promoting investment in PhD research, promoting investment in research centres. So all of a sudden, a lot of things were happening very quickly in geography departments after that period of stagnation in the 1980s. There were still more and more students going to do degrees, and more students were going to do geography as part of their degrees. Roughly about this point in time, I think, 1990s, early 2000s, there might have been on average 500 students on average doing first year geography minute. Today it's more like 300. So more and more students. Now, however, there was more new lecturers being hired. So instead of maybe one lecturer being hired after a wait of 15 years, now it was a case that maybe a geography department might be getting a new lecturer every 2 or 3 years. So there was more money in the economy. The Celtic Tiger, one politician, I think it was Michael McDowell, said during the Celtic Tiger, he says the country is awash with money. There was more and more money, and a lot of this money in education, a significant amount went into investment in universities because the government felt that investment in universities was good for the economy. You were ensuring a trained workforce. And especially given that the Irish economy was moving very much in the direction of white-collar employment. As I said, I didn't say this, sorry. The Irish economy really was going to be based around services, and you needed an educated workforce. So the government basically decided, you know what, investment in universities is going to pay off. We're going to have this trained workforce, and this will help attract more and more investment into Ireland, especially when people realise we've got this highly skilled, highly trained workforce. So more and more new full-time lecturers were appointed, and geography departments started getting bigger and bigger. At the same time, as I said, there was this growing interest in the government, and particularly Micheál Martin, who was then the Minister for Education, this growing interest in investing in research. So new research centres were created. The National Institute for Regional and Spatial Analysis, NIRSA, in Maynooth. Also ICARUS, which is the climate change. I should be able to tell you what ICARUS stands for, but that was the climate change research body or institute in Maynooth, and the National Centre for Geocomputation. So 3 new research centres, all of which were closely tied to the geography department, were created in Maynooth in the late 1990s, early 2000s. Now, there was another recession. I'm sure you're probably more aware of this recession than the 1980s recession. Another recession kicked in from 2008 to 2014. And this also led to another period of reduced investment. So there was another period where no new people were really being hired to join geography departments. I think in Maynooth, the last 2 full-time hires in Maynooth before the government decided, okay, that's it, no more full-time people being hired in universities. The last 2 new hires were, I'm talking here about being hired on the full-time basis because we were both working in Maynooth for years before that. Conor Murphy and myself were the last full-time hires before this economic recession between 2008 and 2014. If we hadn't been given full-time contracts at that point in time, we could be doing something totally different today. And maybe you wouldn't be suffering as much today, so hey-ho. Now, once the economic recovery kicked in from 2014 onwards, once again, there was kind of a growing level of investment again in universities. And you start to see a kind of opening up once again of a kind of increased level of employment of new lecturers from 2014 onwards. The problem for geography probably from 2014 onwards is that student numbers in geography from this point onwards weren't at the same peak levels as they were at in, say around 2005, 2006. So as I said, in Maynooth today, we have about 300 first years in geography, maybe more, slightly more. At one point in time in the mid-2000s, I think we had 530 students. So there's been increased numbers of people being hired in universities, but a lot of these new hires probably have been now going more to other subjects such as business studies, in Maynooth, business studies, psychology, law and criminology. So a lot of the newer subjects are probably getting more hires as well at this point in time. Now, this is Mark's slide. So Mark suggests, he says, look, one of the points he makes is that all the major trends in global geography, or maybe I should be saying more Western geography or Anglo-American geography. Mark makes the argument that all the main trends in global geography could be seen in Ireland in the 2010s, particularly. So critical geographies, post-colonial geography, applied geography, and geographical informations, or GI science, and big data. And he goes through that. He actually talks about that when he was talking about this last year in the lecture. He went through, I'll do the same. I'll try and recap his ideas. So basically making the point that all these major trends in global geography or Anglo-American geography or Western geography can be evidenced in Irish geography as well, and indeed can be evidenced at a more local level within Maynooth geography. So he says, well, critical geographies, he talks about the work of Mary Gilmartin, Karen Till, and others. Yeah, critical geography, I would actually suggest, is a very strong strand running through the Maynooth Geography Department. Probably the leading geographer in this grouping is probably Mary Gilmartin, but you can also you can probably include the vast majority of human geographers, I would suggest, within this grouping. So Patrick Bresnahan, Mark Boyle, Jerry Kearns, Karen Till, Alistair Fraser. So nearly all the full-time geographers would be classed within this critical geographies grouping. Probably the likes of Chris Van Egret, Martina Roach, and myself we do work looking at inequality, but I don't think we'd probably be officially classified as critical geographers, to be honest. So critical geographies, as I said in the previous lecture, are very, very strong element running through modern geography, running through 21st century geography. Is it a standalone approach, or is it an umbrella for a number of very closely related approaches? That's open for debate, but it's very much a case that it's a very strong strand running through Maynooth geography, and indeed running through much of Irish geography. Post-colonial geography, post-structural geography. You look at Maynooth, I'd say there's two leading people in Maynooth who would be very much closely associated with, say, the post-colonial tradition or the post-colonial approach. The two that stand out, Mark mainly just refers to Jerry Kearns here, and Jerry Kearns is very much would be very much associated with the fields of critical geopolitics, but also post-colonial geography. The other major person associated with post-colonial geography would be Mark Boyle himself. Moving on then, more applied geography. The more applied geography, I would probably think the geographers who might be more coming under this umbrella within the geography department, maybe Chris Van Egret, maybe Martina Roach, maybe myself. We might be more likely to be classified as applied geographers. You can also see evidence, of course, of applied geography in the different research institutes that are closely linked to the geography department in Maynooth University. A classic example of a geographer who is very much an applied geography as well is the man in the picture there, Jim Walsh, who was the head of the geography department for a number of years, then was the vice president of Maynooth University for a number of years. And he was very much someone who was in that vein of applied geography. Probably originally a spatial scientist, a quantitative geographer, but most of his work was very much policy-based work, writing reports that would be advising either government agencies or other agencies, particularly in relation to something that was, I don't know if it's still a thing today, the National Spatial Strategy. Last of all, geographical information science, GIS, geocomputation, very strong elements also in Maynooth. The NCG is based in Maynooth, so that's the National Centre for Geocomputation. That's led by Chris Brunsden. Geographical Information Systems has a strong tradition in Maynooth, going all the way back, I would say, to the late 1980s, early 1990s, when Dennis Pringle, who was my PhD supervisor, Dennis Pringle he started teaching an honours option course on computer cartography. The idea of computer cartography was very much a new thing in the early 1990s. And this was effectively the seeds of Maynooth establishing a program on geographical information systems and remote sensing. The three leading people there were Dennis Pringle, Ronan Foley, and Paul Gibson. Conor Callahan has taken over the reins of that program. And then that later on probably created the context in which the National Centre for Geocomputation, it was decided that Maynooth would be the ideal place to locate that. So the main point there from Mark's work last year, the main point to note, all of the major traditions, all the major trends in global geography can be evident in Irish geography today and can also be evident within Maynooth. So Irish geography isn't like it was in the 1950s and 1960s. It's no longer out of kilter with the rest of the world. The same trends you see at a global level, you can see evident in Ireland. And indeed, some Irish geographers would today probably be ranked as some of the world's leading geographers, including some people in Maynooth. In terms of publications, people like Chris Brunsden, Rob Kitchen, they compare very favourably in terms of their publication records. Mary Gilmartin, Mark Boyle, Jerry Kearns would probably be seen as one of the leading geographers in the world in their particular fields of study. Well, where did the old geography go? What happened to old style regional geography? Now, regional geography as an approach, as we said, or the French style, obviously originated in France, but probably the one country where old style regional geography really had resonance, really took up strong roots, was in the Republic of Ireland. And regional geography stayed a very influential approach within Ireland, probably until the 1970s, maybe even into the 1980s. Probably as part of this, Irish geography had a very strong tradition of historical geography, and that was closely linked to the regional geography, the inheritance or the knock-on effects of regional geography. So there was a very strong tradition of historical geography within Irish academic geography, probably up until the end of the century. And then over time, this tradition started to disappear off the scene to some degree. Now, do we have any regional geography today? We don't have regional geography courses really as such anymore in Maynooth University. I think the last such course was, we had a course on North America a few years ago, a course on Australia over 10 years ago. The old tradition of having a course, standalone course, looking at a specific region, we had a course on sub-Saharan Africa, which ran for a long time in the 1990s and the 2000s. So the old traditions of regional geography, they're largely old style regional geography is largely disappeared from academic geography. The one holdout is Willie Nolan. Willie Nolan is now a retired, he was a professor of geography in the University College of Cork. He's now retired, but he's still a man who's producing a lot of work in conjunction with other geographers. Willie Nolan's probably one of his main contributions is he's done a series of books offering geographical and historical perspectives on different Irish counties. And he's covered each, I think as of now, he's covered nearly every county in Ireland at this stage, or if not, he's very close to having covered every county in Ireland. And these books involved contributions from historians as well as contributions from geographers. So I'm happy to say I did make a contribution to two of those books, the Monaghan book and the book for Westmeath, where for both of them I wrote kind of an electoral geography history of County Monaghan and an electoral geography history of County Westmeath. Unfortunately, the Laois book was finished before I got a chance to have a cut at that, but there you go. You win some, you lose some, guys. So Willie Nolan's books is probably the main it's the main evidence today of this old, strong tradition of regional geography in Ireland. Now, regional geography, as I said before, it had its fallbacks, it had its problems. But in a way, it almost became like the main Irish contribution to geography, given how strong regional geography was in Ireland. And one of the things Marx asks is, one of the things he suggests, with this growing trend towards global geography, and global geography, sometimes you can equate global geography with Anglo-American geography, given the level of influence the USA and the United Kingdom has over geography, particularly in the English-speaking world. He says one of the knock-on effects of this trend towards global geography, of countries like Ireland catching up with the rest of the world, or trying to catch up with the rest of the world, is that the old traditions of geography in that country can disappear. So while old-style regional geography had its fallbacks, in a way, you can almost look back on it as the good old days of Irish geography in some ways. We were poor, but we were happy. That, okay, it had its fallbacks, but back then in the 30s, 40s, there weren't that many full-time geographers, but there was a lot of geographical work being done. And the Irish geographers operated as a community of geographers. When there was a major Geographical Society of Ireland field trip involved, most academic geographers would join it. Nearly everyone in Ireland would go once the Geographical Society of Ireland or the annual Irish Geographical Conferences began in the late 1960s. Most geographers in Ireland went to the annual Irish Geography Conference, or the Conference of Irish Geographers. That's the correct terms, guys, sorry. Conference of Irish Geographers. So in past days, when we were poor but happy, Irish geographers operated very much as a community. And there wasn't really the big distinction we have today between people who were political geographers or social geographers or cultural geographers looking at subdisciplines, and physical geographers and human geographers often work together, especially say during the field trips in the 40s and 50s. They all generally worked together. They brought together their different ideas so in a way, it might have been looked on as a more holistic view of geography, it could be argued. Nowadays, however, the Irish geographical community is probably less coherent. There's a lot more geographers, but a lot of the new hires that came in from the 1990s onwards, as I said, the new hires that came in the 1970s were all nearly Irish-born geographers. The new hires that come in from the 1990s onwards, you start to see a lot more people from outside of Ireland being appointed, and that has its knock-on effects, I'll argue. New geographers who in some cases had more in common with geographers from other countries and had closer academic links with geographers from other countries, but also geographers who often found that they worked happier. They were happier working with, say, sociologists and anthropologists than they were with, say, other geographers from Ireland, or even other geographers in their department. So that is probably the nub of the question in terms of Irish geography today. In some ways, you look at Irish human geography today, you say, okay, scores very high in terms of research impact, scores very high in terms of publications, scores very high in terms of the number of scores very high in terms of teaching, and hasn't gone down the route of geography departments in Britain where all the senior geographers are doing little or no teaching and all the teaching is being done by postgrads. You still have high profile geographers in Ireland still actively teaching both postgraduate students but also undergraduate students. So in some ways there's a lot going for Irish geography, but in losing the old traditions of regional geography, one of the questions might be, have we thrown the baby out with the bathwater? So geography in the 2000s, these were the challenges Mark highlighted. One of the challenges is to do with staff-student ratios. There's a lot more students going to university today, but there's also a lot more competition. There's more. Back in the old days, when I went to Maynooth for the first time in 1989, there was a relatively small number of departments. And certain departments attracted a lot of students and generally always attracted a lot of students. So English, history, Irish, geography. In more recent times, there's been more and more programs added to universities such as Maynooth. So business studies, law and criminology, psychology. And with more and more offerings, there's more and more competition for students. And as a result, that's going to have a knock-on effect on terms of staff-student ratios. But staff-student ratios, in turn, can have a knock-on effect in terms of university decisions when it comes to deciding which department should get a new hire, which department should get a new lecturer. And in universities like Maynooth, with all these new departments emerging, hoovering up hundreds of students, it's put pressure on the older departments like history and geography to try and keep up with the newer departments like business and law and criminology. And the basic argument is if a department wants to grow, they also have to try and grow their student numbers. So if you're losing numbers, you're not going to get new hires. That's the basic new model in universities. Now, this isn't an issue, thankfully, so far in Maynooth, but we're starting to see what's been called a process of schoolification of geography departments. What I mean by that, you have universities like UCD where you don't really have a standalone geography department anymore. You have a school of geography and something else. So School of Geography and Archaeology, or School of Geography and Planning, which does again limit geography, because if you don't have a standalone geography department, it does reduce the ability for geographers to kind of get together, discuss geographical issues and so on. The loss of geography as a core subject at junior cert level, I think that's going to have a knock-on effect. I was president of the Geographical Society when the final stages of this decision was going through. And I'll be honest, when I took over, it was probably too late in the game at that stage. History and geography were both up on the chopping block. History ran a brilliant campaign to argue that history should remain as a core subject, but personally I thought geographers were not really on the ball. By the time I became president, it was probably too late. We kind of made a late surge, but the campaign was too late and it wasn't as strong as history. So the loss of geography as a core subject at junior cert level, I think it's going to have a knock-on effect down the line for geography and geography departments, because the reality is you've got to expect that 4 or 5 years down the line, there'll probably be fewer and fewer students coming to do geography. And with fewer and fewer students doing geography in schools, there might be even less demand for geography teachers. So that is a point of concern, particularly in Ireland. The last point I'll talk about is the maintenance of the Geographical Society of Ireland, but also the maintenance of an Irish geographical community. So as I said, back in the old days, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, even the 70s, 80s, and even the 90s, there was almost this sense that Irish geography were poor but happy. That the Irish geographic community was a small community, but it was a community where everyone knew each other. It was a community where people generally were happy to work with each other. It was a community where physical geographers and human geographers would work together. It was a community where you had a Geographical Society of Ireland with a large number of, by and large, voluntary amateur geographers. And that was brilliant. That was a real dimension. Nowadays, the Geographical Society of Ireland no longer really has these amateur geographers anymore. The Geographical Society of Ireland really today is effectively made up of geography lecturers, but not all of them, and a large number of geography postgraduate students. The Irish geographical community, it's obviously there's a lot more geographers. Has it got stronger or weaker? I would suggest, and I leave this up to you to decide because you can read the articles on that are posted on Moodle. Irish geographical community as a community has probably got weaker. Partly this is down to geography's own success. So new hires came in the 1990s. As I said, a lot of these new hires in the 1990s and the 2000s were often people hired from outside of Ireland. And there was a reason for this, because from the 1990s and 2000s onwards, another thing you start to see in geography, and not just geography, in universities as a whole, you start to see more and more competition between universities to get high up on university rankings. You start to see competition between geography departments to get higher up on university rankings. So the big idea from the 1990s onwards was the best way to push yourself up the ranking is not to hire in new lecturers, new first-time lecturers. The big way to push yourself up the rankings is to hire in professors from around the world. So you start to see more and more senior people being employed, people who are coming from England or the USA as opposed to Ireland, and people who really probably had a lot more connections with geographers from other parts of the world than with Ireland, and didn't really fully join in with the Irish geographical community. So what we've seen really in more recent times is the Conference of Irish Geographers, which is the annual conference where you get paper presentations, an annual meeting of Irish geographers. The Conference of Irish Geographers, in more recent times, you've seen a smaller proportion of geographers from across the country taking part in this. Usually, Maynooth and Trinity College often provides most of the membership, most of the people taking part at these conferences. Conferences go from university to university. So next year, I think the conference is in Cork. I think it's coming back to Maynooth the following year. So usually, in more recent years, you're starting to see most of the attendees coming from the home university, but also Maynooth and Trinity. And there are some geographers who will never go to a conference of Irish geographers. There are some geographers who will never write for the Irish Geographical Journal. There are some geographers who won't even join the Geographical Society of Ireland. Many of these geographers, really, their main contacts are with other geographers from other parts of the world. They might be the people they're more likely to work with, to write with. But some other geographers, their main contacts, as I said before, with this growing level of interdisciplinarity running through the social sciences, you're starting to see more and more geographers developing closer ties with sociologists and anthropologists and other people working in other social sciences than the ties to develop with other geographers, sometimes other geographers in the Republic of Ireland, sometimes even other geographers in their department. So in a way, the Irish geographical community has become better resourced in the last 10, 20 years, even with that mini recession between 2008 and 2014. But as a body, it's definitely a lot more, definitely a much more divided body of geographers than it was in the times when we were poor but happy in the 30s, 40s, 50s and 60s. We've lost that tradition of the amateur geographer. With the Geographical Society, we don't have that big number of amateur geographers we had in the 1940s and 1950s, which ultimately kept the Geographical Society of Ireland going. The Geographical Society of Ireland now has more or less become a kind of addendum onto the geography departments. It's really there as a resource, as something there to offer support to Irish academics, but particularly mainly postgraduate students. And really, it's lost the ability to attract in amateur geographers, people who just have an interest in geography as a subject. They don't go to, they might want to go to university, but the problem is, like, what do you offer these amateur geographers? In the 30s and 40s, they were offered the chance to go on annual field trips with the society. They could get the Irish Geography Journal. Nowadays, do amateur geographers really want to read the Irish Geography Journal? It's probably become a bit too complex, a bit too difficult for amateur geographers to read. For all its failings, at least regional geography as an approach was readily accessible to the general public. The general public could read articles in regional geography. If you look at some of the more complex work being done in human geography today, a lot of that work is not accessible to the general public. So unfortunately, there have been very good developments in geography, in Irish geography, in the last 20, 30 years, with greater levels of funding. But there's also been greater levels of competition, which has a knock-on effect in that more and more people are now putting more emphasis on research rather than teaching. More and more people are going on sabbaticals. There is a danger that Irish geography might ultimately go down the same route as British geography, where the more senior members of a geography department don't really actually teach undergraduates. Now, we haven't, as I said, we haven't gone down that route yet, but I do have my worries, I'll be honest. But there's more and more emphasis now on research, and with changes, with growing levels of competition, as I said, I talked about the university rankings and the need to kind of promote research. There's also growing levels of competition between academics because of the changing nature of promotion. Back in the good old days, promotion effectively came to you if you were stayed long enough in the department, you would eventually be promoted. Promotion today is much more competitive. It's a bidding process, and you really need to have a strong research record to get ahead in the battle to get promotion. The knock-on effect of that for geographers today is you really have to think seriously about what you invest your time in. So if we take, say, Milieu, the Student Geography Society magazine here, William Durkin and I have more or less edited that magazine over the last 5 years. It takes a long time to do. And we sort of do it because we believe it's important for the students. It's important as a legacy, especially for third-year students, to have an annual edition of Milieu for your own year. It's something that you can say, okay, I went to geography, I went to university, I did geography, I got my degree, but I also wrote an article for Milieu. I got my first ever piece of work produced. So it's all these little things that make geography departments more communal, that make things more special for geography students. Unfortunately, they're not the sort of things that are rewarded in the promotion rounds, in the promotion battles. So promotion battles, competitions over promotion, competitions over university rankings, I think these have also changed the nature of universities. You don't have that same kind of sense of camaraderie and togetherness that we had back in the days when we were happy but poor. I know Maynooth University myself has changed a lot since when I was a student in the late 1980s to today. No longer can you claim that everyone knows everyone in Maynooth. Maynooth's a lot bigger. There's 13,000 students now, maybe 2,000, 3,000 when I was a student here. So the universities got bigger, but in some ways, as it's become more corporate, more focused on promotion, on competition for promotion, departments become more focused on competition to move up university rankings. The question is, like with that tradition of regional geography, are we losing something as a result? Anyway, what I would suggest, if you're really interested in this material and you're thinking about doing this potentially as an exam question, don't take what I said at face value, be critical. I've given you some ideas in this lecture today. I gave you some ideas in the lecture on the history of human geography in Ireland in the period up to the 1970s. So I've given you a lot of ideas. There's a lot of other ideas you can draw from, especially from articles from the Irish Geography Journal. And if you look at Moodle, I posted a number of these on that, so you can get links to those. Anyway, I'm right on the hour mark, folks. This is it. This is the end. This is the very last lecture where I'm giving you new course material. So anything from now on, there's no new course material. So you have all that you need for the exam in January, which by the looks of it, probably might be on the 13th of January, scary, but not a Friday, not a Friday. So you now have all you need to be able to do the exam. We've finished the new course content. The last 3 or 4 sessions in the last 2 weeks of the semester, I'm going to be focusing on exam techniques, trying to give you advice on how to write a good exam answer. But I'll also be doing some revision. I'll be also honing in on what I would consider to be some of the big ideas in the module this year. I leave you to think about that for yourself. Anyway, all the best.